Hi everybody, today I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a major part of current Northern Territory Indigenous policy, the Northern Territory Emergency Response. Now, many of you may know this as the intervention. Now, the intervention was put in place by the former Howard government in June 2007. Ever since its inception, the intervention has been surrounded by controversy. Basically, how the intervention started was that there was an explosion of media stories about child abuse, sexual abuse, etc. in Indigenous communities in remote parts of the Northern Territory. So, the Howard government, through the minister at the time, Malcolm Brough, arranged to have this emergency. Basically, they said that the abuse that was going on in these Indigenous remote communities equated to a national emergency response. So because of this, the army with their tanks and with their medical staff and medical supplies, police, etc., began arriving in these Indigenous communities. And of course, a lot of Indigenous people in these communities had absolutely no idea what was going on. Okay? So that's basically how it started. And the Howard government offered a range of reasons to justify the intervention, and these included things such as frustration that the Northern Territory government did not move quickly enough to implement the recommendations of the Little Children Are Sacred report that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, and also a genuine commitment by the Howard government to do what they say was to get in and do something, to highlight the failures of the NT Labor government, and to gain political points on the eve of an election. Now, the intervention was used to carry out these broad measures to abolish the Community Development Employment Program that we've talked about. And for those of you who may have missed that, basically CDEP, the Community Development Employment Project, or program as some people refer to it, was implemented in the 1970s, and it was a scheme where Indigenous people could perform community work and get paid unemployment benefits, and it was supposed to give them the on-the-job training that would then move them into what people call real jobs. Of course, in many communities there is not a labour market for people to move into real jobs. And as I've said previously, there is this great big myth out there that Indigenous people have never worked and do not want to work, when Indigenous people around the world were often exploited for their labour. As I've said, if we were to see a video of the White House in America from 100 years ago, we would see that the people doing all of the cooking, the gardening, the washing, the looking after the kids were all black people. The same is the situation in Australia, in industries such as the cattle industry, for example. So, getting back to this, the intervention was going to abolish the CDEP program. It was going to introduce widespread alcohol restrictions in Aboriginal communities. It was going to introduce welfare reforms to prevent welfare payments being spent on substances and to ensure that money is being used correctly, whatever that means. It can link school attendance to welfare payments. It was going to introduce compulsory health checks for Indigenous children to identify and treat health problems that are a result of abuse. It was going to do away with the permit systems. This is where if you were going to travel to a remote Indigenous community, you would have to go through the local land council and get a permit to go onto that land. It was going to arrange local work groups to work for the dole to clean up and repair communities. It was going to improve housing through implementing, in brackets, normal rental arrangements. It was going to ban pornography and conduct audits of all public computers, and it was going to appoint people into positions that were going to be called government business managers. Now these people were going to be employed on probably a little more than $100,000 a year, and their job was to live in these communities essentially and drum up business proposals that the community would benefit from. Now the intervention was enshrined in legislation, which meant that it overrides the Anti-Discrimination Act. So this meant that Indigenous people could not refer to the Anti-Discrimination Act because they were having their welfare payments quarantined, etc., based on the fact that they were Indigenous. And as I said, because of this, they could not refer to the Anti-Discrimination Act. So they really didn't have a leg to stand on. An Australian government review revealed that Aboriginal people, in the main, did not support the race-based approach of the intervention, and that Indigenous people were not engaged in the process. However, this review did suggest that there was some support by Aboriginal people for alcohol restrictions and increased policing. Of course they want to feel safe, and they have a right to feel safe. The Australian Indigenous Doctors Association released a statement on the intervention and stated that the intervention had a negative impact on the health and well-being of Aboriginal people, and it also reduced their trust in governments and government agencies. The United Nations has also criticised the intervention, and they explain that in its current form, the intervention discriminates against Aboriginal people and infringes on their human rights and their rights as Indigenous people. Now, the United Nations, of course, support the Australian government's attempt to address the disadvantage of Indigenous people and to protect women and children of any cultural background. However, the United Nations believes that this needs to be done with due regard to the human rights of Indigenous people and with due regard for Indigenous people's rights to be free from discrimination and indignity. The intervention contradicts documents that the Australian government have signed, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The intervention contradicts all of these positions that Australia has signed on to uphold. Today, the rules of the intervention are being experienced by non-Indigenous people. So all welfare recipients are subject to income management. Of course, this is only the case now. Prior to this, it was just Indigenous people in remote communities. Now, just as a bit of a side note here, in Canada, Indigenous people actually became involved in child protection. This started in 1981 when the federal government allowed Indigenous organisations to deliver childcare protection services. And this involves allowing Indigenous agencies to use Indigenous kinship structures in child protection. Today, nearly 40 organisations Indigenous organisations deliver child protection services in Canada. Now, returning back to the Northern Territory. Now, what happened was the Northern Territory government established a board of inquiry in response to these allegations of sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities, probably more to do with the fact that it was receiving lots of media attention at the time and the Commonwealth government had become involved. Now the Northern Territory government asked this board to do the following things: determine if Aboriginal kids were being abused, with a particular focus on unreported cases of abuse, identify problems in the way governments provide child protection services in Aboriginal communities, assess ways that the governments can work with Aboriginal communities to create awareness of child protection and to prevent child abuse. Now the board travelled to 45 Aboriginal communities and also received written submissions. So this basically is where people have an opportunity to provide written submissions to the board by a certain date. Okay, and so anybody can do that, arguing their concerns. The board also talked to individuals, agencies and organisations. The board tried very hard to create an environment where people would feel comfortable coming forward with sensitive information or asking sensitive questions. The board made 97 recommendations to the then Chief Minister. Now, some of the important points made by the board include that child abuse does exist and is often unreported, that Aboriginal people are keen to improve their lives and their children's lives through improving their education, that it is extremely important to remember that child abuse exists across the entire Australian community and beyond, that the child abuse problems that are occurring in Aboriginal communities is a result of past and current neglect of Aboriginal communities by governments, that there is a strong connection between child abuse and poor health, low levels of education, poor housing, unemployment and poverty, that government departments need to work together better in the area of child protection in Aboriginal communities, that programs aimed at child abuse need to be funded for the long term. In the main, the recommendations put forward by the board were recommendations that governments could use to empower Aboriginal communities to prevent child abuse in the future. Now, some of these recommendations included education. In the main, the board urged the government to improve the systems used to educate Aboriginal kids, to develop local languages, and to make education work better in Aboriginal communities. The board also mentions the term education in the context of creating awareness among individuals and in the entire community about child abuse. Alcohol. The board recognised a strong connection between alcohol, violence and child abuse, and as such recommends that governments take urgent action to reduce alcohol consumption in Aboriginal communities. Family and community services and the police. The board recommends that family and community services and the police work better together and work better with Aboriginal communities, and this included a hotline that provides information and support about child protection. Family and support services. The board recommends assistance be provided to strengthen family support services in Aboriginal communities. Empowerment of Aboriginal communities. The board recommends that governments develop ways to empower Aboriginal people in decision making at a local level. Commissioner for Children and Young People. The board recommends that a position be established as a Commissioner for Children and Young People that reports directly to Parliament on the well-being of children and young people. Now, the government's approach to the intervention was that it was in the immediate and long-term interests of Aboriginal people, that it would provide them with a better future. So when people began to argue against the intervention, governments and government supporters and supporters of the intervention would say, well, we have to save the children. Okay? And this is something I'm going to return to a little later. So things such as child health checks that I mentioned earlier began immediately. The intervention was applied to all prescribed areas. These are areas of land held under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. Over 70% of the NTER Aboriginal population live on these prescribed areas. Of course, there is a view in many Aboriginal communities and among many supporters of Aboriginal communities that the intervention is and always was race-based, that Aboriginal people were being stereotyped and blamed for a lack of interest and commitment by governments, that the real problem was decades of government neglect. If you get a group of people and they've had their culture and traditional economies damaged and destroyed, and they are living in a remote location without employment opportunities, with low levels of education, poverty, shortfalls in housing, health issues that have been unchecked, and a lack of police, there are going to be problems. This happens all around the world and happens in urban areas such as cities and towns as well, even where policing exists. So Aboriginal people, as I said, will say, yes, it is a problem, but the problem is that the governments didn't care or less about us out here for so long, so therefore these problems have become the way they have. In some communities, Aboriginal people welcomed the police stations that were constructed when the intervention began, and of course those police stations should have been there all the time, because people should be able to feel safe as Australian citizens. There is also support among some communities for the reduction of alcohol and the improvements in housing. Now, one of the things that's very important to remember here when you have dispossessed groups who are living disadvantaged lifestyles is that reductions in alcohol do not necessarily mean reductions in substance abuse problems. This is an education problem. So people who, for example, say, no, we don't drink alcohol, can think that replacing the substance of alcohol with something else is okay. And of course, it causes just as much problems. Now, as I said, the intervention began with the police, the army and volunteer aid workers arriving in Aboriginal communities. As I said, when people oppose this, the saving grace for politicians on all sides of politics was that we need to save the children. And of course, for example, if I went to Sydney or Brisbane or wherever and somebody had done something wrong, I should not then penalise everybody that lives in Brisbane or Sydney. I should have the resources to make sure that the person who's done something wrong is penalised appropriately. I shouldn't penalise everybody for it. And of course that's what happened under the saving grace of we have to save the children. Now John Howard, of course, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was well known for being opposed to ACIKE. He was opposed to native title and land rights, and was well known for being opposed to reconciliation and governments apologising for the removal of Aboriginal children. The terminology used to stereotype Aboriginal people, national emergency, has not been matched with an adequate response. Very little has changed in Aboriginal communities since the intervention came about, except people now have other people in charge of their money and they are being micromanaged and they have no human rights. And of course, the easiest and best way to do this is exactly how it's done in urban areas. Put police in these communities and put adequate police resources in these communities. The intervention is the biggest Commonwealth government takeover of a state or territory government in history. Now you remember that, as I've said previously, this was made possible through the 1967 referendum, which was about 2 points, including Aboriginal people in population estimates, as, of course, at the time, they came under the Flora and Fauna Act. And the second part of the referendum was to provide the Commonwealth Government with the power to take control of Aboriginal affairs from state and territory governments whenever they wanted to. And that's what we saw with the intervention. Many Indigenous people and supporters of Indigenous rights would argue that the intervention should have occurred a long time ago. However, the intervention should have been into the NT government's failure to provide services to Aboriginal communities. The federal government's intervention was a clear display of no confidence in the NT government to deal with Indigenous affairs. It was actually revealed through a special project by the Council of Australian Governments at the Aboriginal community of Wadeye in the Northern Territory that the Northern Territory government were using the generous funds that they were receiving from the federal government to use in remote communities to keep them in power in urban seats. Because the NT government had been using generous funds from the federal government, those who needed the most support and assistance were receiving the least. It was revealed that for every $1 spent on every NT kid's education, 47 cents was spent on an Aboriginal kid's education in an Aboriginal community. Because of this, some may argue that the NT government should not have been criticised. Some would argue that the NT government should be criticised rather than the federal government. The authors make the point that the Labor government, this is one of the authors of the reading, Langton reading, the author makes the point that the former Labor government were using Indigenous funds for their own purposes. However, it is important to point out that the Labor government that this reading is referring to was the first of its kind in Northern Territory history. Prior to the Labor government coming in, we had a CLP government for 26 years. Here they were the only government since self-government. So the intervention has two sides to it. There are people who are going to support it, but these people should also be saying to the governments, well, how can you expect our people and our communities to look after themselves when there is nothing there to help us to achieve that? In town, of course, we ring the police come. In remote communities, people do not have that option. Okay, there is distances, there's all sorts of things that are involved. There are access to communication channels, etc. So the intervention really should have been about government's failure to provide services and develop Indigenous communities. And all that has happened has Aboriginal people have been further stereotyped as a result of that failure. It's a bit like government policy and Indigenous affairs that we spoke about in week 1. All of us sitting here today can go off, we can develop policies about Indigenous communities, allocate resources to them, and then when those policies fail, we will be given another project to work on, and of course the media will and society will blame the Aboriginal people for wasting all that money, when of course the Aboriginal people were not part of the decision making process. We were, and we're just going to go on and develop another project somewhere else that is going to probably be a failure, and of course the only people that it will affect are the Aboriginal communities. So again, I want you to think about the intervention from both perspectives. Then what I want you to do is do the reading, and I want you to say whether you support the intervention and why, or whether you oppose the intervention and why, and put that on a learn line. I don't want you to go into pages and pages of stuff. Keep it brief and concise, but make it clear, okay, so that we know what you're talking about.